All right, so thanks for the organizers for inviting me to present this paper here. So the title is very revealing. So the paper is about managers' personal bankruptcy costs and how they affect firms' financing and investment decisions before firms file for bankruptcy, ex ante. If you look at in the related theoretical literature, so there are many models that imply that making bankruptcy states costly for managers could actually be beneficial. It could reduce things as strategic default, risk shifting, inefficient investment on part of managers, essentially keeping the manager disciplined by making bankruptcy states costly. But on the other hand, there are also models that imply that making bankruptcy states too costly for managers might make them risk averse to the extent that they abandon projects that are NPV positive if they involve risk. Okay. While all of those are plausible arguments, what is really empirically relevant or dominating in the data is something that we still have no evidence on, and this is the objective of this paper, to look at how variation in managers' personal bankruptcy costs affects firm behavior. The reason why this is difficult to study that is, in general, it's difficult to get some exogenous variation in managers' personal bankruptcy costs. So what I use in this paper is a bankruptcy reform in Korea that happened in 2006. So there was a very drastic change in the bankruptcy law. Under the old system, before 2006, when a firm filed for bankruptcy, the incumbent management was forced to resign, replaced by a court-appointed trustee who would then auction the firm to new investors. In contrast, starting from 2006, we have something very similar to Chapter 11 in the US. So the manager stays in control of the firm, proposes a reorganization plan, and then we have this bargaining game, which is more similar to what you would think about the Chapter 11 situation in the 1980s, early 1990s in the US. Okay. So this has drastic consequences for managers' personal bankruptcy costs, and on the next slide I will show you that those were really dramatic. So before the reform, the manager knew that with almost certainty he would lose control over the firm as soon as he files for bankruptcy, whereas after the reform there's a high probability for the manager to stay during the reorganization process and also when the firm emerges from the reorganization. The reason why we had this reform goes back to the financial crisis in the late 1990s. So when the IMF and the World Bank stepped in, among other reforms, they demanded Korea to bring its bankruptcy law in accordance with what they called international best practice, but essentially meant the US law. Okay? And while many of the other reforms were implemented relatively quickly, it took 9 years for this reform to be implemented, finally in 2006. So what you can see here, so this is just looking at the highlighted number, how significantly the situation changed for managers. So under the old system, so there were two old systems. For the sake of time for the presentation, we can focus on this one, which is relevant for the larger firms in this sample. There were very few reorganizations before the reform. I will show you more detailed numbers on this. But the probability for the CEO to stay in control of the firm during reorganization was just about 5%. This increased to almost 90% after the reform. So in 2006, we really woke up in a different world from the perspective of the CEO. In terms of ownership transfer, that was more than 90% before the reform when the firm was auctioned to new investors. After the reform, it's only about 20% that the firm is auctioned to new investors or that ownership changes during the reorganization process. And we can see that this changed firms' behavior. So if you look at the number of reorganization cases, so firms filing for bankruptcy reorganization in column 1, that was very rare before the reform. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that anticipating that as soon as they file for bankruptcy, they would lose control of the firm, managers tried everything to avoid filing for bankruptcy. Well, this drastically changed after this reform. So if you look at the annual filings for reorganization, that's really exploded. Okay? So by 2010, we had more than 1,200, starting from about 2030 under the old regime. And this cannot be explained by changes just in economic conditions. If you look at liquidation filings, yes, they increased a bit during the crisis period, but this increase is substantially lower than its reorganization filings. So the main identification strategy, since there are many things changing clearly after 2006 in Korea, is to compare firms that are more sensitive to this change in bankruptcy law to firms that are less sensitive. So if you think about firms that are risky firms, so firms that are close to the bankruptcy boundary for whom it's more likely to end up in bankruptcy states, they should be more sensitive to changes in the bankruptcy law compared to firms that are far away from the bankruptcy boundary. For example, we would expect that a firm like Apple might care less about changes in bankruptcy proceedings. So there are just some descriptive statistics. I don't have to tell you much about the data. It's the same data that Uchan used yesterday for his study from all the firms in Korea with assets more than 10 billion won, which is roughly 10 million US dollar. They audited, so all their balance sheet and income statement data is available. So you can see that risky firms, so I show the data here for the 20% of riskiest firms and the 20% of safest firms. You can see that risky firms, they tend to be smaller, have higher leverage, not surprisingly pay higher interest rates, have lower cash to assets ratio, and invest less. Those are just a couple of characteristics that I plot here. This is before the reform. So remember, the reform was in 2006. And if you look at risky firms, so the riskiest 20%, the black lines, and the safest firms, the gray lines, you see that in anticipation of the reform, there was not much change in different characteristics. So I took different measures here. You can see firm size, cash to assets, leverage, interest rates, investment, and tangibility. So before the reform, there were not many changes. The only thing that fluctuates a bit is assets. This is just a very skewed, so some large firms can make a large difference here, but there's no general trend in all those different characteristics of those risky or safe firms. But now, what happened after the reform? Okay. So you see in the top graph, leverage, so the debt to asset ratio for the 20% of riskiest firms, that is the black line, and the 20% of safest firms, the gray line. And you can see while indeed the safe firms, they are basically not affected by the reform. So going through 2006, there's no change in leverage for those safe firms when there's a change in the bankruptcy law. In contrast, for risky firms, we see that leverage starts to increase significantly. So when managers' personal bankruptcy costs are lower after the reform, so when this risk of losing control of the firm is significantly lower, we see that firms start to take on more leverage. What you see in the bottom panel is that it's monotonic with the riskiness of the firm. So 1 refers to the 20% of safest firms, up to 5, the 20% of the riskiest firms, and we can see the more sensitive, so the more likely it is for firms to end up in bankruptcy states, so the riskier they are, the more likely, the more leverage increases. One thing that I forgot to mention is, how do I classify firms into risky and safe firms? In the current main measure, I use interest coverage. The reason for this is I have many public and private firms, so this is a simple measure that is available for both types of firms, but I also tried alternative measures, for example, estimating a hazard model that predicts the probability of default. You can think about this as similar as a set score, which leads to qualitatively the same results. Okay. So what about the price of credit? Well, after the reform, again in 2006, we don't see much changes in the price of credit for safe firms, but there's a significant increase in the price of credit for risky firms after the reform. So this appears to start a bit later, so I have to explain how do I measure interest rates. I don't have contract level data, so those are just the interest expenses divided by total debt from the balance sheet. So this is sort of a mixture of existing old debt and new debt. So this increase in interest rate takes some time to pick up, because in 2006 we still have a lot of old debt where the interest rates were determined before the reform. And again, we see that this increase in interest rates is particularly strong for the riskiest 40% of firms, and again, increasing with the likelihood of firms ending up in bankruptcy state. So this combination of an increase in the quantity and price of debt suggests that there's a strong demand effect. So after the reform, when bankruptcy states are less costly for managers, they are willing to take on more debt despite the fact that it's more expensive. What happens to firms' investment? Well, it seems that those firms use some of this additional debt that they're willing to take on for new investment. So in the top panel, again, you see that there's an increase in investment starting in 2006 for risky firms, while there's no increase, even a slight decrease for safer firms that are not affected by this bankruptcy reform. Again, the increase is monotonic, so the riskier the firm, the more relevant the reform, we see a stronger increase in investment. We can also confirm all this, what I showed you graphically here statistically. So what I highlighted here in black are the strictest specification with industry year fixed effects, so comparing the risky and safe firms within the same industry. We can see there's about a 0.84 percentage points per default risk quintile in terms of leverage after the reform, a 25 basis point increase in the cost of debt per default risk quintile, and a 67 basis points increase in investment after the reform. Okay, so overall, this seems to suggest that when managers' personal bankruptcy costs are lower, firms take on more leverage and use this additional leverage for financing new investment. Okay, so now to get a bit closer to really looking at this channel that it's really managers' personal bankruptcy costs driving those results, I exploit differences in ownership. So there's very detailed data on ownership for those firms in the sample. And there are some firms where private benefits of control are higher. So losing control of the firm, both for the manager, think about family firms, for example, but also for controlling shareholders where we have dominating shareholders that can extract rents from minority shareholders. So for them, the old regime where the manager is forced to resign and the firm is auctioned to new investors, for those firms where there are high private benefits of control, this old regime should be more costly. Okay. Additionally, if the CEO has a lot of his personal wealth invested in the firm, so if CEO ownership is high, then the old regime not only leads to a shock to the manager's labor income, but also to his financial income. So if the CEO's wealth is also invested in the firm, the old regime becomes even more costly for the CEO. Consistent with this theoretical prediction, I find that the effect is particularly strong for family firms. Those are the first three columns. For firms with concentrated ownership, and for firms where CEO's ownership stake is high. For all of those firms, what we observe is that before the reform, when managers' personal bankruptcy costs were high, when shareholders faced the risk of losing control over the firm, those firms were particularly conservative in not taking on additional debt to finance investment. Now, while all of those suggests that making bankruptcy states costly for managers leads them to run the firm more conservatively, if you think about the theories that I loosely related to in the beginning, it's still not clear whether this is actually desirable or leads to negative effects. It could be that the old regime was very efficient in the sense that it kept the manager on his toes and made sure that he would not engage in inefficient investment, empire building, and so on. But on the other hand, it could be the case that the firm actually had good investment opportunities, but the manager was just not willing to take on additional risk by financing those investment projects with debt or investing in inherently risky projects to avoid increasing the probability of ending up in bankruptcy states, which were very costly for the manager. Well, having some conclusive evidence on the efficiency of investment is clearly difficult. So I will be very upfront that I just try to provide some suggestive evidence which of those seems to be driving the effects that we see in the data. I will look at two components. The first is which type of firms invest. So are those firms that actually have good investment opportunities that start to invest more after the reform, or are those firms that actually don't have good investment opportunities and now start to engage in potentially inefficient investment? And second, I look at the level of profits. So does this additional investment actually generates additional profits, which then is more consistent with firms actually investing in positive NPV projects. So what do I find? So I use investment opportunities. Again, I have the same issue that there are lots of private firms, so I use the most commonly used measure, the kind of the lagged sales growth to proxy for investment opportunities. An alternative, what I do is I look at industry-level Q measures from publicly listed firms in a given industry and look at whether firms in industries with good investment opportunities invest more after the reform, leading to qualitatively similar results, quantitatively a bit lower, because clearly this industry sorting is less precise than the firm-level sorting. But I mean, in the end of the day, so what I find is that it seems that risky firms with good investment opportunities seem to start more after the reform. So firms that had good investment opportunities before the reform were not willing to take on additional leverage, which would increase the risk of ending up in bankruptcy states to engage in this investment. When I look at firms' profits, I find that also risky firms' profits increase significantly more compared to safe firms, which suggests that this additional investment that they undertake actually led to an increase in profits, which is more consistent with them investing in positive NPV projects. I don't have time, so I didn't show you all the cross-sectional tests, but essentially, for all the firms that I find investing more for different types of measures, all of those firms experience an increase in profits after reform. So exactly those firms that invest more, we see that also their profits increase more. As a side note, when I look at cash flow volatility, so changes in cash flow volatility, those firms also become riskier in the sense that in the 5 years after the reform, cash flow volatility is significantly higher for risky firms relative to safe firms compared to the pre-reform regime. So again, when managers' bankruptcy costs are lower, this suggests that firms are willing to take on more risk. So we see for risky firms, there's an increase in cash flow volatility. And again, all those firms that start to take on more leverage, start to invest more, they experience this increase in cash flow volatility. The final piece of evidence is looking at innovation, which is an inherently risky activity. So if managers are indeed willing, or firms are indeed willing to take on more risk when managers' personal bankruptcy costs are lower after the reform, this might also be reflected in their innovative activity. So I look at innovation input, R&D spending, and output, so the patents that they produce, and I find that firms both increase R&D spending after the reform, those risky firms, and after some time, they also start to produce more patents under this new regime, suggesting that lower bankruptcy costs also lead to more innovation. Now, there are some things that I discuss in more detail in the paper. I don't have time to discuss in detail here. I will just pick on them very briefly. So there's a lot of things going on in the background. So if we think that indeed there might be an inefficiency from this old regime, that managers were not willing to invest in positive NPV projects, well, then the question is, why don't we find some alternative contracting solutions that could undo the effects of this bankruptcy regime? Firms and creditors could just meet in out-of-court restructurings and agree on restructuring without forcing the manager to resign. The main problem with this argument is that the bankruptcy law is mandatory. So any private contract that the firm and creditors would write, they're ex post, it might always be beneficial for the creditor actually to deviate. As soon as the firm fails to make a payment, the creditor can take the firm to the bankruptcy court where the creditors are in control. Thus, even if they would write a contract ex ante not to do that, ex post they can always deviate because the bankruptcy law overrules those private contracts. So they cannot credibly commit to not forcing the manager to resign, and there's anecdotal evidence on this actually from some reorganization cases that before the reform, even in out-of-court restructuring cases, in more than 80% of the cases, the manager was forced to resign. We could think about different compensation contracts. So if bankruptcy states are so costly before the reform, well, why don't we provide large transfers to managers under this old regime? We could even make them secured creditors. The main argument against this is that, well, in bankruptcy states, there might just not be enough funds to compensate the manager for losing all this future labor income and the control of the firm and all the private benefits. Since the time is over, I just want to talk about one last thing very briefly, the external validity of the results. So this is a study in Korea. The ownership structure, governance might be different in Korea, so how valid or relevant are those results beyond the Korean context? So if we think about the benchmark of like a perfectly diverse firm with diversified shareholders, where governance is perfect in the sense of aligning managers' incentives with shareholder incentives, then those results might be less relevant. But in many countries around the world, we know that, well, there are issues with governance. We know that ownership structure, this diversely held shareholders, is actually rather rare. So we have many family firms and concentrated ownership, even in the US. So in this context, the results should be relevant. And then I will stop here.
From Hideki Miyajima, he told me that Julia Frank couldn't come this time. Okay, so I just quickly read this paper. So first, let me quickly summarize this paper. So this paper has two parts. The first part is a theoretical model. It's a 3-period incomplete contract model. If you know incomplete contract, you will know that the cash flows and also private benefits are observable, but unverifiable. So incomplete contract, not a complete contract. In this model, private benefits play a key role in contract because the only way for creditors to force the entrepreneur to repay debt is just liquidate his future private benefits, okay? The background of this paper is the change in bankruptcy law in South Korea. So for the past pre-reform law, bankruptcy legal system, because South Korea and Japan share the same, actually, bankruptcy system. Japan also had the composition law and the reorganization law and the liquidation law, okay, till 2000, I think. After 2000, I think Japan abandoned the composition law and instead created a new law. It's called also rehabilitation law after 2000. Absolutely, I agree that reduction in personal bankruptcy costs will encourage risk-taking. So look at this model. I summarize the theoretical predictions is piecewise or non-monotonic, okay? So, okay. So there are 5 regimes, okay? For this regime, no change, okay? This actually, I think that they invest in profitable project. Don't anymore for this regime, okay? Here is no change in investment and profit, but increase in interest rate. For this regime, okay, so increase in investment in risk-taking and also increase in interest rate. But for this regime, no change, okay? So it's a piecewise, I think, reform effect depending on private benefits. So the empirical results is more risk-taking among riskier firms after reform. So my first comment is there's big gaps there, okay, between model and empirical work, okay. So in empirical work, the author uses proxies several for private benefits because even you assume private benefits are observable. Usually we cannot say so how much are a private benefit. They use ownership first, okay? CEO ownership and ownership concentration or family firm dummy, okay? But the theory predicts that the reform effect is piecewise. So you need to identify piecewise reform effects, like I think Mook, Schreifer, Wishley, 1988. So it linked, I think, managerial ownership to market valuation. They found a very significant non-monotic relationship between ownership and valuation. You can apply this approach and to identify piecewise reform effects on risk-taking. It's my first comment. My second comment is about the chaebols, okay? When you talk about the South Korean economy, you first need to talk about chaebols. The chaebols are very terribly powerful. So I'll tell you a true story. Just like the month, the young leader of Samsung Group was arrested, okay? He gave 8 million, not one, US dollars, to the best friend of former South Korean president, I think Park Geun-hye, okay. If you read the Crescent's 2000 paper, it's about Southeast Asian ownership structure, okay? So you will find that the ownership structure among chaebol is very unique. It's a pyramid ownership plus interlocking ownership in Japan, okay? So it's very, very difficult to figure out private benefits among chaebol firms, okay? So among chaebol firms, ownership structure, or family firm dummy, or ownership concentration has nothing to do with private benefits, actually. So we need to carefully identify private benefits among chaebol firms, okay? This is my second comment. The third one is about personal guarantor. I think it's quite common in Japan and in South Korea. If you want to lend money from banks, first I think entrepreneurs first need to provide collateral, okay, for the houses, and also personal guarantee. Your wife or your relatives, your friends, if you cannot repay debt, so personal guarantors need to pay. It's actually it's also big social problem. I think just last week, Japan revised civil law, okay? Tried to impose some restrictions on such personal guarantees, okay? So my question is, in United States, Mr. President Trump, I think, filed for bankruptcy 2 or 3 times. It is said, I don't examine, okay? But he's still rich, and he won election, and now he's the United States president. But I think it never happens in South Korea, okay? So my point is, if a CEO provide personal collateral or personal guarantee or a third party personal guarantee, is he or she able to stay after filing for bankruptcy? Actually, the South Korea government has been trying to change this issue. Okay. I think another legislation in 2008 and also a legislation in 2012, okay? So you need to carefully identify influences of such legislations on personal bankruptcy costs. There are also any changes in bankruptcy, exemptions of personal bankruptcy law, okay, in South Korea. So it can be more important than corporate bankruptcy law. I understand that you carefully check the efficiency of risk-taking after bankruptcy law reform. But if we look at the Fig 3 and Table 4 and Fig 5, so what does it mean? Least profitable firms get more credits than most profitable firms. And the least profitable firms invest more and more after the reform. So such regulation results resemble unnatural selection results in pig and rose grain is 2005, okay? So we don't know after the reform, maybe more and more zombie firms can survive after the bankruptcy law reform, okay? So I think there are three purposes of bankruptcy law. The first is to force inefficient firms to exit quickly. The second, provide opportunities for some firms to reorganize. They also provide opportunities to, I think, a fresh start of bankrupt persons, okay? So if we want, I think my suggestions, you just look at the changes in components of riskiest firms, okay? So more and more high-tech firms among riskiest firms after the bankruptcy reform. So it's my suggestion. Also, you can examine bankruptcy reform is value enhancing, or it just creates more and more zombie firms, okay? So I suggest is use, I think, apply John Litthoff and Young's approach, okay, to look at the relationship between risk-taking and corporate performance before the reform and after reform. And before reform, after risk-taking is suboptimal. You will find a positive relationship between risk-taking and performance, okay? After reform, it's optimal. You will find a low relationship or weak relationship between risk-taking or negative relationship between risk-taking and performance. Then you can say that bankruptcy reform, okay, in South Korea is efficient enhancing, or actually it is influenced by chaebols, okay? So it just did favors to chaebols. You know, in South Korea, it's different from Japan. Banks are not owned by chaebols. I think, in my understanding, okay. So there is always conflicts between banks and chaebols, okay. So chaebols want the legislation for pro debtors bankruptcy law. So my last suggestion is just focus on risk-taking of startups. Okay, startups is very, very risk, okay, than established firms, okay. I think a bankruptcy law reform have huge impacts on startups. So you can find the more efficient startups after the bankruptcy law reform in South Korea. So my last comments, okay, don't worry, okay, I save time for you. It's about default risk and reform effect. You use a dummy variable, okay? Quintile dummy variable, because just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's quite simple. We have one hand, and we have 5 fingers, okay, on one hand. But the Y is 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. So it might be non-linear, okay, or piecewise, okay. Your theoretical model provides no prediction for the relationship between default risk and the reform effect. So my suggestion is just perform regulations among each quantifier separately, and then compare reform effect among different quintiles. You then can identify piecewise reform effect. So I enjoy this paper very quickly. I think a great idea and greater potentials, but more challenging jobs to do. So good luck. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much. Would you like to collect some questions? Or would you like to respond?
So first of all, thanks for jumping in the last minute and for all the comments. So just a quick reminder. So the disconnect between the model and the empirical results. So the model does not do any hypothesis development. It does actually not provide any clear predictions. So the model is basically just an illustration of the trade-off that personal bankruptcy costs can have a positive effect in terms of making managers more disciplined, so increasing actually the supply of credit, but it can also have this negative effect on demand for credit. So that in the model, it doesn't develop hypothesis, so that is not the purpose of the model. It's basically just illustrating the trade-off that exists, so that actually empirically it's ambiguous what we should find or observe. In terms of the ownership structure, so that is a relevant comment regarding with respect to Korea. I actually do account for those things. They have very nice data in terms of they do not only list the shareholders, for example, firms or the spouse of the CEO, but for every shareholder, also the relationships are there. So we can account for all of this, but actually that is my fault. I do not describe this in detail in the paper. So your comment is valid here, and I should just describe that I can account for this with the data that is provided. This personal guarantee reform in 2008, I was not aware of that, but my understanding from the way that you explained that, so if these personal guarantees were sort of removed or weakened after the reform in 2008, that should go into the same direction to making bankruptcy states even less costly for managers, so sort of just amplify the effect. I will look into this into more detail, but that is my first reading or understanding the way you explained it. Less profitable firms receive more loans. Well, it's not actually clear whether all risky firms are less profitable. You talked about tax firms, for example, in the end. So it's not clear whether those are all firms that don't have good investment projects. Actually, what we observe is that they do start to invest more, profits start to increase. So it's not clear whether those are actually unprofitable firms or that banks are sort of making a mistake, or you sort of call this as inconsistent with the Rosengreen. Instead, it seems to be more of a demand effect that those firms could have had access to those funds before, but now when bankruptcy states are less costly, they're just willing to take on this additional risk to increasing leverage. This change in the composition of firms, there might be more tech firms. So there are two things in the paper. On one hand, I control for industry year fixed effects. So to some extent, that should account for changes in the composition of firms. Plus, I also have an alternative specification that I didn't have time to present today, where I actually follow the same firm over time, how leverage, investment, and so on changes after the reform. So there's no change in the composition of firms because I basically follow the firm from before to after the reform, the same firm over time. So the zombie firm argument is sort of, I think, not consistent with the fact that after the reform, we actually see those firms starting to invest more. So if we would have more zombie firms hanging around because sort of the bankruptcy regime is more generous, that would be not consistent with the fact that they generate higher profits and start to invest more after the reform. And finally, do chairboards influence the reform? Well, the reform was sort of decided externally by this IMF and World Bank, them stepping in. What I could definitely look into more is the precise timing. Why did this happen in 2006, not in 2004? Whether there was some political economy or something. I can look into more detail. It's a valid comment.
All right. You want to start?
Thanks a lot for this very interesting paper. Being a legal scholar myself, I'm mostly interested in the policy implications of your study. This is part of a long-standing debate in corporate insolvency law about whether one should rather have a more creditor-friendly or debtor-friendly insolvency regime and what that does respectively to firm performance. Now, there are two findings in your paper that prima facie seem to be hard to square. Riskier firms show higher profits. That's good news. On the other hand, creditors demand higher interest rates. And the question is how to square these two things.
So
Wait a minute.
Okay.
So one thing that you might have left out in the analysis that explains that is, what does the reform do to the likelihood of insolvency and expected bankruptcy costs? and how are the recovery rates of creditors changed under the new regime. So it may well be that riskier firms show higher profits, but we have few risky firms that survive, and many more than before are forced into bankruptcy. And bankruptcy costs are dramatically on the rise, and also the recovery rates of the creditors go down. And that's reflected in the higher interest rates of the creditors. So your data, it seems to me, are perfectly consistent with an overinvestment story basically going on, more credit being available, and debtors using the new opportunities under this new regime to just prolong their life and engage in gambles at the cost of the creditors.
So I think for the first part, you basically gave the answer that I also wanted to give. So the higher increase in profits and the higher interest rates, they're not inconsistent in the sense that the higher profits, they might increase the pie, so it might be good for firm value, but the share of creditors is lower after the reform because the recovery values are lower. So I mean, basically you explained that perfectly. So the firms, even if they invest in positive NPV projects, so even if that would be positive, it could still be negative from creditors' perspective because they know in bankruptcy states they will have lower recovery rates. So they benefit less from this increase in profits. So I think that is the first part of the reform. So I try to be upfront about this. So you can make stories of this still being sort of an inefficient sort of type of investment, right? So I just can say what I documented, that it seems that this sort of high Q or good investment opportunity firms that start to invest more and they increase profits. But I agree with you that it's not conclusive evidence. So the story that you pointed out, that they might sort of over-invest or increase the probability of default, excessively increasing bankruptcy costs, I certainly entertain this possibility. So I think I provide some suggestive evidence, but clearly it's hard to really provide conclusive evidence that one regime is more efficient than the other.
No, Francesca.
It's a bit more of the same thing, if you want. It is exactly what are the welfare implication, in the sense that the larger investment, again, if you think in terms of R&D, is the typical investment. I don't know if it enters into yours. I don't know the details, but you can't monitor. So it's a way to steal cash flows, right? And it's been inherently, if I understand, also in your model. It's between private benefits of control or still cash flows, and the more you invest. So the larger profits still don't justify the investment. So I wonder whether you can try to look at the differences between, for example, the type of investments, that is where it's easier, so it's more easily justify empire building or still in cash flows, or some differences in the characteristics, for example, of family firms versus more empire building that could justify. So if you could look at some cross-sectional differences that could try to get in the end and the welfare, because it's really, you know, even your model would say that could bring to exactly the opposite direction.
So yeah, it's similar the answer to that. So I think I provide suggestive evidence now. That's also why the paper is called Managers' Personal Bankruptcy and Risk-Taking. So this is where I'm confident of saying that it leads to more risk-taking when bankruptcy costs are lower. So maybe looking at the type of investment could be an interesting or good way, depending on how much detail of data I can have on this, to kind of see whether this is also more consistent with sort of what you call justifiable investment, or some type of investment where it's easier to kind of try to steal from the creditors. That could be a potential way to try to push this a bit further.
One question, you're isolating one aspect of the reform, but what about the broader story? So the reform obviously addresses some deficiencies in bankruptcy law. So essentially, I have bad bankruptcy law before the reform. So from the lender's perspective, I don't lend, or at least at unfavorable conditions. After the reform, I get good bankruptcy law. So I'm willing to lend more at more favorable conditions. And maybe this is something that actually drives the results. I think the empirics are pretty consistent with that story too.
So actually, regime, so I didn't show this part. The regime before the reform was profitable for creditors. So their recovery values were higher before the reform. And I actually find, so if you look at firms, for example, firms with low tangible assets, where it's harder for creditors to recover value. In the old regime, that didn't matter as much because the firm was sort of auctioned to new investors and creditors were paid from those proceeds. After the reform, so we know that bargaining power for shareholders, managers is higher in this type of firms, and I see that for them, actually, the increase in the cost of credit is relatively higher, suggesting that creditors actually demand compensation for those lower recovery values that they have. Looking there in the cross-section, for example, at this type of firms. So what I didn't present here is kind of looking at the recovery values, but actually for creditors, the situation was better before the reform. So it seems that despite the fact that there's actually a negative effect on the supply after the reform, the demand effect is dominating equilibrium. So despite the fact that credit actually becomes more expensive, firms are willing to take on more leverage.
Thank you. So I have two questions. One is whether you can say a little bit more about the firms that went into reorganizations, what happened with them afterwards, so the afterlife of sort of a more debtor-friendly bankruptcy regime. And the other question I have is sort of to think about different groups of creditors. There's also the tax creditor. And I've looked into this in Eastern Europe. These countries have gone through similar reforms in the 90s and early 2000s. And it seemed that this gave the tax creditors a little bit more leeway to actually go after the firms rather than risking bringing them into liquidation earlier. So I'm just wondering whether you know a little bit more about different groups of creditors who might have been active in filing or pushing the debtor to file for bankruptcy in the new regime.
Okay. So about the second part, I have to say I have not looked into this. So this is something that I potentially can or should do. On the second part, what happened to firms afterwards, I actually have a table in the paper that gives some details on that. On the top of my head, I don't know, but I actually can look it up and can talk about this later. So my recollection is that after the reform, in general, firms that went into this bankruptcy process were in better health because they didn't try to delay this in the same way that they did before the reform. But what I also have to say is that clearly the results, or what I'm talking about the paper, is really just about the ex-ante effects. I have very little to say about the sort of ex-post efficiency. One aspect as well, I cannot even compare those firms. They enter this bankruptcy process at very different times of their life cycle. So I'm sort of trying to be agnostic about the effects on the ex-post efficiency. But I have a table, I will look at this and we can talk about this.
My question is, how much, how would the bankruptcy law reform, particularly the debtor in possession, affect the risk of the personal risk of the CEOs? I understand in both in the United States and in Japan, even though after the debtor in possession reforms, the very few CEO can stay more than 3 months after the filing. And so did you check that exactly how many days the South Korean CEO stay after the filing of that?
Yes.
And and also another question, I was wondering, the 2008 was the Lehman shock year, and in Japan, Japanese financial authority strengthened their so-called evergreen policy. Try to not to let the small and medium company to bankrupt but by the government subsidies. I was wondering if such a similar policy was taken in South Korea, that impact is more stronger than the reform of the bankruptcy law.
Okay. So let me start with the second point. So the first thing is, so the general this crisis period is a relevant concern because that sort of overlaps with the post-reform regime. The first thing is the effects start very clearly in 2006, which was before the crisis started. Plus, because of this concern, I actually extend the sample, which I didn't present today, and also look at what happens in 2011, 12, 13 after the crisis, and I find that all those effects persist. So it's not that there's a temporary effect in the financial crisis driving things, but it started early and it continues to persist. Those effects of higher leverage, increased investment, the higher cost of credit. The first question, so how long do they stay? So I have a table also in the paper, and it's quite substantial that in this debtor in possession, conditional on the firm surviving through this process, there's a high probability for the CEO to stay in control. And even so I started to write this paper, so I collected the data until 2015. So even until 2015, a large fraction of CEOs was still in control for all those filings between 2006 and 2010. They were still a large fraction was still in control even in 2015, so 5 to 9 years later. So there's a significant change for CEOs.
Maybe some Korean comment? No comment from the Korean? No?
Regarding the question why it took so long to come up with the new bankruptcy code, it's related to our legal system. And actually, pre-crisis, we had 3 different bankruptcy laws, bankruptcy code, and also the composition code and reorganization code. And reorganization code was strongly influenced by Japanese code, which was modeled after the US Chapter 11. So, and our bankruptcy code, pre-crisis bankruptcy code, was influenced by the German code. And it was technically very difficult to, just combine these 3 separate laws into one. So it took, a long time.
Yeah, and it should be said in defense of Korea, even if you look in other countries, the US, recently I saw a presentation on Brazil, it seems that this process of changing the bankruptcy law, it takes almost like 10 years. Or I think in the bankruptcy reforming in 78, if you look at the legislative history, it also took 10 years or even more from when they started to plan this reform to this even being implemented. So that seems to be kind of a complicated piece of legislation in general.
Renee, maybe. Renee, on
that. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that for a paper that has managers' personal bankruptcy costs in the title, there's very little actually about managers in the paper. And so I think that it'd be interesting to look a bit more. So first, I don't understand why you don't have manager fixed effects. I mean, it'd be really interesting to know for the same manager, how did the strategies change when the own manager's bankruptcy costs change, right? So I'm not sure if there's something about your setting that wouldn't allow for that, but that to me would be very compelling. And then also I think it would be interesting to look at managerial characteristics and see whether there's variation in the types of characteristics associated with personal bankruptcy costs that would buy you some cross-sectional heterogeneity. So I think that would be.
So in most of the cases, basically the reform is a change in manager's personal bankruptcy cost for the same manager. It's true that I did not check that for all of those firms that I'm looking at, that the manager didn't change, and that could change things. So one thing, I could just throw out firms where the manager changes, if that could drive things. The variation that I use in terms of not manager characteristics, but is the ownership of managers. So when they have a larger ownership, then this old regime of losing not only control, or not only the position as a CEO, but also losing the control over the firm in terms of the shares, so the shock to financial wealth. This is sort of the variation that I exploit at this point. What I should also be very clear about is that I also discussed this in the paper. So I don't view this really as a sort of an agency problem, that it's really the manager's personal bankruptcy cost very distinct from shareholders. On one hand, in Korea, often shareholders and the CEOs, they are related. And also the bankruptcy costs were not only higher for managers before the reform, but also for shareholders. Sort of this transfer of control, losing the private benefits of control, also applied to shareholders here. So I actually don't view this as an agency conflict, but it's more in the view of thinking about an owner-manager this sort of view of the manager. So not really distinguishing here the manager from shareholders' incentive.
The title is indeed a bit misleading. Yes. the title is misleading relative to the content
Because
that
it's-
you described, right?
Yes, because it's also the cost for shareholders change as well.
Right.
And it's not really separately studied.
Okay, one last comment, or what's the phrase? Or else forever hold your peace or something? All right, coffee. Thank you very much.